And I used to put two pullovers on and film them that way.
At 52, Dirk Bogarde stood before the cameras with a woman on his arm. The press called her his fiancée. The truth was far more complicated. For decades, Bogarde carefully staged these moments, using fake romances to protect the one man he truly loved. Beneath the flashbulbs, he carried the burden of a secret life, and the cost of that secrecy would shape not only his career, but his very soul. To understand why he chose masks over honesty, we must go back to the very beginning. To a boyhood caught between privilege, war, and the dream of escape. Dirk Bogarde entered the world on the 28th of March, 1921, in West Hampstead, London. His full name was Derek Jules Gaspard Ulrich Niven van den Bogarde, a mouthful that reflected his family's mixed heritage. His father, Ulrich, worked as the art editor of the Times. His mother, Margaret, had Scottish roots and a gentler touch. Dirk grew up in a household where books and art were valued, where conversation was sharp, and where expectations pressed down quietly but firmly. London in the 1920s was still shaking off the trauma of the Great War. Jazz clubs hummed in smoky basements. Women with cropped hair and cloche hats strolled the streets, while the elite gathered in drawing rooms heavy with cigarette smoke and hushed scandals. For a sensitive boy like Dirk, this atmosphere was intoxicating. He listened closely, soaking in the elegance and contradictions of the adult world. His childhood was not without shadows. School was often cruel, and his dreamy, artistic nature set him apart from tougher boys. He found escape in sketching, reading, and performing imaginary scenes alone in his room. Friends recalled him as a boy who could lose himself entirely in make-believe, his expression shifting like a stage actor rehearsing lines only he could hear. By the 1930s, the world was shifting again. Britain braced for war. Radio broadcasts carried the rising tension across Europe. The air buzzed with uncertainty, and children like Dirk grew up knowing the world might break at any moment. This sense of fragility, of lives interrupted and love silenced, would stay with him. When the bombs began to fall during the Second World War, Dirk joined the British Army, serving in intelligence and seeing firsthand the devastation across Europe. He returned to civilian life with deep scars, but also with a determination to carve out a new self. Acting, which had once been a childhood escape, became a path forward. The stage lights offered not just applause, but reinvention. And soon, Hollywood's golden glow began to call his name. After the war, Dirk Bogarde began cautiously, testing his talent on the British stage. He was striking, with sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and a subtle elegance that set him apart. At first, directors weren't sure what to make of him. He wasn't rugged like John Wayne, nor was he classically handsome in the matinee idol sense. Yet there was something magnetic about his presence. By the late 1940s, Bogarde signed with the Rank Organization, a powerful studio in Britain that groomed its young actors like royalty. Rank polished him, dressed him in finely cut suits, and sent him to premieres. He was promoted as a heartthrob, the perfect young man women could swoon over. Photoplay magazines splashed his image across covers, painting him as the dashing bachelor. His breakthrough came in The Blue Lamp in 1950, where he played a charming but dangerous young criminal. Audiences were transfixed. Here was a star who could embody menace and sensitivity in the same breath. More roles followed. Hunted in 1952, Doctor in the House in 1954, and Cast a Dark Shadow in 1955. Each film solidified his reputation, each performance pulling him closer to stardom. By the late 50s, Bogarde was a box office draw. The Doctor comedy series made him beloved across Britain, while darker roles hinted at the depth of his craft. Hollywood producers began to notice. He worked alongside international stars, his name whispered among critics as one of the most gifted actors of his generation. But fame was a double-edged sword. Studios demanded not just performances on screen, but carefully managed images off it. Bogarde, unmarried, became a target of speculation. Reporters asked about girlfriends, fan magazines dreamed up romances, and when none seemed real enough, publicists arranged staged photographs. The pressure to present a perfect heterosexual image grew heavier with every premiere. Behind the tailored suits and charming interviews, Bogarde began to live a double life, one for the cameras and one for himself. Behind the facade of studio-manufactured romances, Dirk Bogarde built a private world that few ever glimpsed. At its center was Anthony Forwood, an actor turned manager with a calm presence and sharp wit. They met in the early 1950 seconds, drawn together by a mix of professional trust and quiet affection. Over time, their bond deepened into something closer to family than friendship. To the outside world, Forwood was simply Dirk's business partner, his loyal assistant who handled contracts and managed the daily details of a demanding career. But behind closed doors, they shared a home, meals, and the small comforts of ordinary life. Forwood became the anchor in Dirk's restless, high-pressure world. Yet, to protect that bond, they needed camouflage. That was where the false engagements came in. Photographers would catch Dirk smiling beside glamorous women actresses, models, sometimes colleagues' wives. The stories would appear in fan magazines, Bogarde, finally ready to marry. Each headline was a shield, designed to keep the truth hidden. The studio approved. The public sighed with relief. And Dirk returned to the quiet sanctuary of his house with Forwood. Friends who visited remembered their household as warm and inviting, filled with books, records, and conversations that lasted deep into the night. But secrecy shaped everything. Invitations had to be managed carefully, dinners timed so that outsiders never suspected too much. In a Britain still ruled by anti-homosexuality laws, discovery could mean career destruction, or worse, public humiliation and criminal charges. Dirk once hinted in private letters that his greatest fear was not failure on screen, but betrayal off it. A single indiscretion, one photograph in the wrong hands, could erase everything he had built. The weight of that knowledge made every kiss stolen behind locked doors, every glance exchanged in a crowded room, feel both precious and perilous. The irony was sharp. Millions adored him as a romantic lead, yet the one love he cherished most had to remain invisible. It was a balancing act that demanded constant vigilance, and over time, the strain of silence left scars. Rumors began to circulate. Whispers in smoke-filled clubs and industry backrooms. For Bogarde, the risk of exposure was no longer distant. It was at his doorstep. By the 1960 seconds, Dirk Bogarde stood at a crossroads. His fame was secure, his acting respected, but the shadows around his personal life were beginning to close in. The press had grown sharper, sniffing for scandal. Gossip columnists whispered about why Britain's most eligible bachelor had never married. Fan magazines hinted at heartbreak, while some industry insiders murmured darker suspicions. At the same time, the roles that once protected him as a romantic leading man began to change. Bogarde took bold risks, moving into films like Victim in 1961, where he played a barrister blackmailed for being gay. It was the first British film to use the word homosexual. And though critics admired its bravery, the film sparked outrage among censors and conservatives. To many, it seemed a little too close to Dirk's own life. The performance was lauded, but it also tightened the net of speculation around him. Studios grew uneasy. Contracts came with morality clauses, and executives demanded assurances. Rumors of his closeness to Anthony Forwood trickled into private conversations. Dirk felt the walls of discretion closing in. He had spent years carefully orchestrating his image, posing with women at premieres, smiling for staged engagements. Now, the risk of exposure loomed larger than ever. The emotional toll was brutal. He became more guarded, more watchful. Friends noticed his laughter fading into silences. He avoided long stays in Hollywood, where tabloids prowled relentlessly. The fear of ruin haunted every choice, every interview. At times, it seemed as though the role of Dirk Bogarde, the actor, had consumed Derek van den Bogarde, the man. Forwood, loyal and steady, remained by his side, but even their home became a place of tension. What if a visitor spoke too freely? What if a photograph betrayed them? Every shared moment carried the unspoken knowledge of danger. The crisis reached its peak in the late 60s and early 70s, as the press turned more aggressive and Hollywood less forgiving. Bogarde's star power dimmed in America. Roles that once flowed freely began to dry up. He retreated to Europe, seeking quieter projects, more artistic films, and a measure of control. Yet the sense of exile was heavy. The cost of secrecy was not only loneliness, it was the erosion of a career that might have soared even higher. At his lowest, Dirk confided to friends that he felt trapped in a cage of his own making. Loved by millions, but unable to live as himself, he carried the weight of silence like an iron mask. By the 1970s, Dirk Bogarde reinvented himself. He turned away from the commercial machine that had once defined him and embraced European cinema, where directors sought complexity over charm. Films like The Servant, 1963, and Death in Venice, 1971, cemented his reputation as a daring, serious actor. No longer the polished doctor or light-hearted romantic, he became the face of darker, more challenging stories. Audiences who once adored his smile now watched him embody decay, obsession, and moral conflict. Behind the scenes, life with Anthony Forwood settled into a quieter rhythm. They moved into a home in France, where the countryside offered peace far from the press. Friends described their life as domestic and calm, filled with gardening, reading, and long conversations by the fire. Forwood's health began to decline in the 1970s, and Bogarde took on the role of caretaker, nursing him with devotion until his passing in 1988. It was a partnership never acknowledged openly in the press, yet lived with deep fidelity in private. Bogarde himself shifted toward writing. His memoirs and novels revealed a keen eye for detail, a wry humor, and an undercurrent of melancholy. Readers sensed what he could never say directly, that his life had been shaped by secrets, by a love hidden behind the curtain of respectability. His books won praise, making him one of the few actors to achieve equal distinction in literature. The world around him changed. By the 1980s and 1990s, conversations about homosexuality were no longer confined to whispers. Younger actors came out, activists marched, and society slowly bent toward tolerance. Bogarde watched with mixed emotions. He had lived through an era where a single headline could destroy him. Now, he saw others walking paths denied to him. In interviews, he remained cagey, never fully acknowledging what many already knew. But there were moments, brief flickers, when he hinted at truths buried under decades of silence. He spoke of loyalty, of companionship, of the cost of lies. In those reflections, one could glimpse the man behind the carefully managed mask. In his final years, Bogarde lived quietly in France, then returned to London. He suffered strokes, his once sharp voice reduced to a whisper. Yet visitors remembered his eyes still sparkling with intelligence, still carrying the weight of unspoken stories. He passed away in 1999 at the age of 78, leaving behind not only a body of remarkable work, but also the shadowed outline of a life lived half in light, half in darkness. Dirk Bogarde's life was a study in contrasts. On screen, he embodied confidence, danger, and desire. Off screen, he lived behind a veil, arranging false romances to protect the love he could never acknowledge publicly. He survived by crafting illusions, even as the cost of those illusions grew heavier with each passing year. His story is not just about fame. It is about the sacrifices demanded by an unforgiving system. He loved deeply, cared faithfully, and built a career of extraordinary artistry, all while carrying a secret that could have destroyed him. Today, we can see him not as a man of scandal, but as a symbol of resilience. When we look back at Dirk Bogarde, we see both triumph and tragedy. A brilliant actor, a gifted writer, and a man who shielded his heart with silence. His journey reminds us that love, in whatever form it takes, is never shameful. What is shameful is a world that forced so many to hide it. So, what do you think of Dirk Bogarde's story? Do you remember his films, his novels, or the striking image he left behind? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more untold Hollywood histories.